Hello. So for this class, I'm doing something a little different since I'm not going to be able to be in class with you. But I didn't want us to lose out on the instructional time. So the chapter that we're doing for this class is chapter 6 in your textbook, which is about observation and assessment. And so the reason that I wanted to make sure that we got this done before I give you the observation assignment is because it's important to talk about what observation is, how it can be used, and how it is supposed to be used. So these are really going to provide you with some good techniques to take as you go into the classroom to go and do your observation. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to kind of walk you through the PowerPoint that is on Blackboard, just as though I would be teaching it in class so that you're not going to be missing anything. The other thing is don't forget that you need to have completed the study guide that I gave you for Chapter 6 and bring it to class the next time that we meet so that you can get credit, as well as just to demonstrate that you did watch this video and read the chapter. So I'm going to now be up in your little right-hand corner as I go through the PowerPoint. And so hopefully you're going to feel like you get the same instruction you would if we were in class. So as I said, this chapter talks about observation and assessment. And I will tell you that assessment is normally seen as a bad word. Nobody likes the word assessment because we think of the word test. But that's not what the intention is. The intention behind assessment is to figure out where children are, but how do we get that information? And then how are we going to use that information? So the first part of the chapter is going to talk about observation, and then the second part is going to talk about assessment. So as we go through, you're going to see that talking about observation, one of the most important things to know is that with observation, it is by far the best assessment tool that we can use in early childhood. So we want to make sure that you know what observation is and how you're supposed to do it. So you'll notice one of the first things they mention is the fact that observations are supposed to be objective. And so what that means is that we have to be looking at things without any bias or any assumptions. So as we get into some of the observational tools, I'll talk about how to make sure that what you are seeing and writing can be considered objective. But we also use observations to determine whether or not the standards for the program and the teacher are being met, and if the goals and the benchmarks for children are being achieved. So when we're looking at observation, there's nothing that you cannot learn about children, about teachers, about programs through observation. So some things that you can observe for is the environment, which is something that you are going to be looking at when I give you the observation assignment, the schedule, which you're also going to be looking at. But then you also start to look at things like the atmosphere. We talked about this in class, about how you can kind of feel whether or not it's a warm classroom, if it's a cold classroom, and I don't mean temperature-wise, I mean with the interactions that we see. We can also observe the curriculum, the children, the families, the team, and the administration. But basically what I want you to see from this is that there is nothing that we can't observe for to get the information that we need to then make informed decisions. So why do we observe? So one of the first reasons that we would observe is to improve our own teaching. So we want to make sure, again, that we are using that culturally sensitive filter. We're making sure that we are not using any bias or prejudice, that we are being objective. So there's that word again. Remember, the difference between objectivity and subjectivity is an opinion. So everyone can have something different. But when it comes to being objective, it would be that we are all seeing the exact same thing. So you would think of it as just simply reporting the facts, what you saw, what you heard, but you don't want to use words like somebody did something because, and the reason is that you don't know why they did something. You may think that you know, but you might not be correct. So objective is just simply reporting and writing down what you saw, what you heard, and not using any kind of bias or prejudice. Team teaching is another way that we can improve our teaching, because sometimes we need someone else to point out to us what it is that we're doing that we may not even realize. It may be a nonverbal gesture that we're using, or it may have been the way that we spoke to a child and we didn't think that it sounded bad, but maybe the team teacher did. So we can also be looking to help each other when we're doing our observations. So a few guidelines to consider is to make sure that we are practicing intensive waiting. And so what that means is that we're not immediately jumping to conclusions, that we are kind of taking our time as we are watching events unfold in the classroom, but it really is trying to stay away from those snap judgments. We also are going to become part scientist, and the reason is because we're trying to figure out why something is happening. And a lot of times that's what the observation is for, especially when we start looking at behavior problems. We really are starting to look at why is this happening, and so we become a scientist. And then engaging in slowing down. Sometimes we don't realize that we are kind of running through things, and so we need to be intentional about our observations instead of just trying to do it as quickly as we can. Another reason that we observe is to construct our own theory. So we've talked about the importance of having an individual theory when you are a teacher in the classroom. And so observations are going to inform your theory. So just like when we talked about the different theorists like Vygotsky and Piaget, and then even getting into more current ones like Maslow and Howard Gardner, we had the discussions where you said, well, I believe this because I've seen it work or I've experienced it myself. So that's where observations can also come in handy. We can use our observations as an assessment tool, and I'll show you a couple of ways that you can do that. We observe to assist families. Sometimes they need our input, especially if it's something, you know, where they're starting to look at, do I need to have my child tested for, you know, special education, for gifted education? And so they'll need our observations to be able to help with that. And then again, going back to that scientist, wonder why something is happening and trying to solve a problem. And it's not always a behavior problem. It could be, why is my lesson not working the way that I thought that it was? And so having to learn how to use our observations to solve that problem is going to be a great way to use these observations. So this is just a graphic that's in the textbook that just kind of shows that when we're looking at using our observations, you just see that it's cyclical, and that just means that we're not stopping after we've done an observation. We're actually trying to continue and analyze and interpret and then make an action decision, but then we may need to go back and we've got to reevaluate. Did that work? Did I get the information that I wanted? So just understanding that observation is just not a one-time event. It is something that you're just going to continue to do, is something to keep in mind when you're using observations. So a few things just to keep in mind as we're understanding the context for observations. Remember, we're looking at children as individuals. So even though we may be using our observations as an assessment tool, we're not looking to try and place all of the children into the same box. So we're having to figure out where children are so that we can then teach them. And so a lot of times that's going to look very much like an individualized curriculum. So remembering that we're keeping in mind the standards, and we are going to talk about those, but remembering that we look at developmental stages, we do not look at ages. And so that's where those standards come in handy to help us figure out where children are at. Every child is going to be different. And so keeping that in mind will help you as you're doing your observations recognize that I'm not trying to get everyone to the same place. I'm trying to figure out where each child is individually, so that I can then work with them, make accommodations if needed, to get them to the next step. Remember, again, we're talking about children just in general, remembering that 2-year-olds are going to be antsy. So you're not going to say, oh, well, during my observation, these 2-year-olds just could not sit still for the 30-minute circle time. They can't. So just keeping in mind that children are children in general. And remembering that we're also looking at the domains, the expectations, and the interactions. Remember that during our observations, we are going to see that the environment and the adults can have an impact on the children's behavior. And we've talked about this before. So if you don't have your classroom set up so that children can easily navigate from one place to another, you actually have created the behavior problem that is probably going to occur as children get upset because they have to, they've gone through someone's block structure, or they interrupted somebody's painting, or they had to walk through the books while the children were trying to read. So as we are looking at observations, we also are looking at, are we kind of the cause of what's going on in the classroom, and recognizing that our behavior can have an impact on their behavior. But then also we're trying to understand ourselves. What are our teaching practices? Are they working? Do I need to make some modifications? Are my expectations realistic for these children? So all of this kind of frames why we are going to be doing observations and the information that you can glean from them. So as we start looking at some common types of observation systems, you're going to see that there are some key elements. We are always looking to define and describe the behaviors, but if you notice, we're never looking to assume anything. We have to make sure that this is something that we could repeat again if necessary, because if it's not giving us accurate results, then we need to look at, is this type of observation actually accurate? Is it giving me the information that I need, or do I need to make some changes? So there's some different types of observations that the chapter talks about. When you get into CHD 165, you're going to learn a lot about observation, and you are going to learn about several different types of observational tools that you can use. So this is just meant to kind of be a crash course in some different ways that you can conduct your observations. But rest assured that when you take 165, you are going to get way more information. So a couple of the different types of observations: narratives, samplings, ratings, and then they also talk about some modified child study techniques that we don't use quite as much, but it is kind of interesting to see some different ways that have been done. So when we look at narratives, this basically is just like narrative means, it's just kind of an account of everything that has happened. So you have different things like a running record, diary descriptions, specimen descriptions, and logs or journals. But basically a narrative is going to be just kind of writing down whatever it is that you saw. The one thing about narratives is that normally you don't go in knowing what you are observing for, because you're just simply writing down whatever does happen, and then you're going back and you're analyzing what it is that you saw. And so that's an important distinction, because a lot of the other types of observational tools, you actually know what it is that you want to go and look for. In terms of this program, the most probably the most common type of narrative that you're going to write is called an anecdotal record. And so you're going to hear about that in a couple of your other classes. But again, in CHD 165, you're going to be actually doing a lot of anecdotal records, and it is a form of a narrative. Samplings are when you are actually trying to get some information about something specific. So the book talks about time sampling and event sampling, and the next couple of slides are going to show you examples of those. So with time sampling, what you're doing is you are taking these different snapshots of time to see what's actually happening. So for this particular one, the teacher wanted to find out what type of play is actually happening during these different times for these different children. So we've talked a little bit about the different types of play. We're going to get into it more in a few weeks. But these different types of play are going to be parallel is where you're just kind of you're sitting next to somebody, but you're not really playing together. Associative is that you are kind of playing together, but it's not for a common goal. But then cooperative is we're actually playing together. So for instance, two children are in the block center and they are working on a bridge together. Whereas associative would be we're both in the block center, but I'm making this and you're making this. It's not really a common shared goal. And then parallel is I've just got two children who aren't even paying attention to each other, but they are sitting next to each other in the block center. So you would use time sampling to see what type of play is actually happening at 9 o'clock, at 9:15, 9:30, 9:45. And so this is just kind of a great way to, throughout the day, see what is actually happening, because we all know that we're going to see children acting differently at 9 o'clock in the morning than we are at 3 o'clock in the afternoon. So time sampling can kind of be a great way to code that. Now, event sampling is a little bit different because you're looking at one particular event. So in this particular case, they're looking at children's accidents. And so what it means is every time that happens, you write it down. So it's not like I'm looking to see, is it happening at 9 o'clock? Is it happening at 9:15, 9:30, which is the time sampling. Event sampling is going to be writing down when it does happen. So you can see that they're going to write down the behavior, all of this information you want to know, and then make sure that you have a recording sheet. So you see that on this particular day, there were 4 instances where there were children's accidents. And so you can see here's who was involved, here's where it happened, what was happening, what the cause was, and then what the outcome was. So again, event sampling I think is a really handy technique, especially when you get into some of those problem behaviors. So for instance, let's say you have a child who bites. So to be able to record every single time that the child bites, that's going to be a great way to have a conversation with the parents, because it's not your word against their child's word. You literally have documented every single time that this happened. And so if you have one of these for 5 straight days, then I think that's a great conversation starter for families. But what I will tell you about observation is the biggest thing is documentation. That is going to be your best friend, because this is your way of proving what it is that you are saying to parents. Because if you don't have something to back it up, even if their child is not the angel that they think they are, the parents are always going to defend their child. So having these types of observations can be really handy. When we talk about ratings and checklist, these are ways that we're kind of trying to chart on a continuum where children are. Now, I will be very honest with you and tell you that I am a much bigger fan of checklist than I am of rating scales. And the reason is I feel like it's harder to be objective with the rating scale. So with a checklist, it's basically you've decided what it is that you want to observe for, and then you're deciding, does a child meet expectations, exceed expectations, does not meet expectations. And so you have chosen standards that you're looking for or goals that you have for the child. And so you're just literally putting it into check boxes. The problem with rating scales is that when you are saying rate a child from 1 to 5 on how well they get along with others, that's such a subjective way to collect this information, because if 5 is they get along great with everybody, you may have one observer who says, oh, well, since I never saw them have a disagreement, that must be what it is. But then the teacher may say, but 3 days out of the week, I have to, have a conversation with the parents because he's biting people. So to me, rating scales are harder to keep objective. That doesn't mean that you can't get some valuable information. But when you think about rating scales, think about those surveys that we take that say whether we strongly agree, we're neutral, we disagree, we strongly disagree. Well, that literally is our opinion. And so it's hard to gather some concrete evidence. You can get data, but that may not give you the information that you need. So when you take CHD 165, I actually have you use checklist as opposed to rating scales. Frequency counts is just, again, it's a tally of how often behavior occurs. So you see that doesn't, it'll give you the number, but it won't give you the information that the event sampling does. So when you look at these different types of observational tools, you really kind of see that I use them in different instances to get different information. And so that's really what I want you to take from that section. When you're observing while you're teaching, you want to make sure that you are gathering and preparing your materials ahead of time. So if you are going to be using a checklist, you need to have that checklist created before you actually do your observations. Consider where you observe, plan where you observe, and make sure that everyone in your classroom is trained, per se, in observing. So if you have a teacher assistant, it's really important to let them know, I need you to be looking for, keep an eye on this child because I've noticed that, he gets cranky at this time, or I noticed that she, doesn't play well with other children. So when you kind of give them things to observe for, then that's just extra power to be able to make informed decisions. So then we get into the section that talks about evaluation and assessment. So remember that especially in early childhood, we're really just looking at how can we get this information, which is through observation, but then I've got to make a determination of where they are, which is the assessment piece, so that I can then plan my instruction. So when we are evaluating and assessing children, if you look here, we're not trying to say, oh, well, did they pass this particular test? We're trying to support their learning, identify special needs, evaluate our programs, provide data for accountability. But our ultimate goal is to help teachers discover who children are, what they can do, and how to help them grow and learn. So from this portion of the chapter, what I really want you to take away is that negative stigma that we have of assessment and evaluation, and realize that if we're doing it with the correct purpose in mind, and we're using developmentally appropriate tools, then it's not going to be like the awful testing that we all remember from when we were in high school. Some other reasons why we evaluate: we've got to establish a baseline, and that's basically, where are we? Where are most of the children at this point? Document children's learning, determine guidance and intervention, plan our curriculum, communicate with families, monitor program accountability and quality. So you see, this is kind of the end result of our observations, is that now we're taking that information so that we can evaluate and analyze what we've learned in order to make our decisions for the future. So some different forms of assessment. Most of us are familiar with the formal assessments, and those are the ones that we probably all have nightmares, because those are the ones that are the standardized testing. And as you know, in the state of Virginia, we use the SOLs, and so anyone who went to a Virginia Beach or a high school in the state of Virginia, you did SOL testing, and as I said, I'm sure most of you probably have nightmares about it. So formal assessments are ones that really, they're the standardized, they're the different screening tools that are used, like kindergarten readiness and things like that. And so those are the formal assessments. We use a lot of informal assessments in early childhood because we use observations, we take notes, we can use self-assessments, naturalistic assessments. Those are just ones that are occurring in the natural environment, so we're not setting anything up for children. We're just simply assessing what's happening during the course of their day. And then another type of assessment is called authentic assessment, and that's where you use a portfolio as a way to kind of make a determination on what children have learned, And so portfolios are actually kind of a really cool idea, because basically what the teacher does is they collect the children's work over the course of the time that they are with the child. And so it really is a great way to document the growth that a child has had over the course of the year. And so I am a big fan of authentic assessments of portfolios, but even if you don't use a regular portfolio for your children in the classroom, I would definitely recommend holding on to different pieces that the child has created over the year, because parents love it. It's a great gift for them, but it also allows you the opportunity to go back and see where the child started and where they ended. So here's a great example. So when children get into kindergarten or first grade, we all remember where we were told to write our alphabet. So let's say that you've asked the children on the first day to write their alphabet. And so you have one child who wrote the entire alphabet. You have another child who they wrote a few letters, but not all of them. And then you have another child who just made scribbles. So we've got 3 different children at 3 different points of this particular skill. So let's say before Christmas vacation, you decide I'm going to have them do it again. So now the child who was able to write all of the letters of the alphabet, well, now they can do uppercase and lowercase. And now the child who could only write a few, well, now they've added a few more to it. And the child who only made scribbles, maybe now can write a few letters, or at least recognizable scribbles that look like letters. And then at the end of the year, you do it one more time, and the child who was able to do it at the beginning, now they're writing in cursive. And the child who had a few, now they can write all of them. And now the child who had scribbles, now they can write their name. Think about how powerful that is to show how far children have come. And so that's what you use portfolios on. It's to be able to document their growth as they go throughout the year. So when we're talking about assessment and evaluation, we do want to make sure that we are using standards. And as we said, standards normally get a very bad rap, because we think about the testing that's associated with them. But really, when we're talking about standards for early childhood, think about the milestones, the foundation blocks, and then we do have the SOLs for the kindergarten through 3rd grade. Now, the standards themselves are fine. What we have done is we've created such an emphasis on testing that we have forgotten that the purpose of the standards is, again, to provide us with kind of a roadmap of what's developmentally appropriate for children that particular age or stage to be able to accomplish. So we have our different domains. If you haven't become familiar with Bloom's taxonomy, then I would highly encourage you just to look it up. Basically, Bloom's taxonomy is a hierarchy of the different levels of understanding and application that we want children to be able to do. So for instance, Bloom's talks about, the most basic form of evaluation and assessment is that a child can, recite something. But then the highest is going to be that they can actually create something based off of what they've learned. So when you write your lesson plans, you're going to be using Bloom's taxonomy. But the great thing is that the standards are already written using Bloom's taxonomy. So Bloom's taxonomy is a list of action verbs. And so they increase by skill and ability. And so if you look at every single standard, you're going to notice that the first word is always an action verb. And so that's where it equates to Bloom's taxonomy. We can also use rubrics and scoring guides. There's tons of them out there commercially, but you can also make your own. And we can use technology to be able to gather some of this information. The big challenge when it comes to using the standards as a form of assessment is that there's the assumption that one size fits all. And again, this goes back to the conversation that we had, that we use stages, not ages, because it's not a one size fits all approach. But the benefits of assessment and evaluation using the standards is it at least gives us an idea of what's developmentally appropriate, and it does give us a sequence of what should be happening as children progress. So the chapter talks about Common Core, and I left this in here simply because I wanted you to have a reminder that we do not use Common Core. We do have the standards of learning, but when it comes to those primary grades, kindergarten through third grade in the state of Virginia, we do use the SOL. So just make sure that you remember that when you're looking at what standards do I need for children that age. And then we talk about some testing and screening. Okay, there's a big difference between testing and screening. So testing, think about whenever we took a test. There is kind of a right or a wrong answer. But the problem with the way that testing is done a lot of times is that it doesn't adequately reflect what children know. So, as we've talked about, if you are not a good test taker, then your score on a test does not actually show what you've learned and what you know. What it showed was that you're not a great test taker. And in all honesty, a lot of people are not a good test taker. I have one child who is a very good test taker, and I have another one who is a horrible test taker. And what I run into, which is what all parents run into, is that your grades are affected by how you do on these tests. But when you have teachers who are not flexible enough to allow for some variations in their assessment techniques, then you're seeing that children are being penalized simply because they're not a good test taker. So that's one of the biggest problems with testing. The other one is that testing really only uses 2 of the 9 intelligences that Howard Gardner talks about. And so I think that's a really important thing to remember when we're looking at testing, is that we're not giving every child the opportunity to prove what they know. Now, screening is a little bit different, because screening is just kind of looking at different factors to determine whether or not we're ready for something. So one of the biggest screenings is kindergarten readiness, but there are screenings that are done when babies are born. There is a hearing screening that every baby undergoes, and so it's not a test. It's just simply trying to determine whether or not there is hearing difficulty or not, because then again, you've got to look and see, are there some accommodations that need to be made, those kinds of things. So screenings are not nearly, they don't have the bad rap that testing does. So again, some of the concerns about assessment: we're making unfair comparisons. There is a bias in the way a lot of questions are written. There's too much of an overemphasis on norms, which means we're, again, trying to fit everyone into the same box. Interpretation is different. So the way that someone looks at the results of these assessments and tests may be completely different. It gives us too narrow of a perspective, but there's too wide of a range. And then sometimes there's just too little or too much. So you see that there really are a lot of valid concerns about assessment, and that's why in early childhood you don't find that we're giving children tests. Instead, we're allowing them to demonstrate what they know, and we're getting our information because we are observing children, talking to children, setting up events where they can prove what it is that they know, as opposed to giving them a pencil and a paper and saying, do this worksheet or do the flashcards. And you all know how I feel about worksheets and flashcards. So this is just kind of a nice summary of using observation and assessment information. So again, there is nothing wrong with assessing. We've got to figure out where children are. But remember these 4 principles, that the standards that we're using should be identifying developmentally appropriate outcomes. So again, it's about knowing where children are. And so if you're using the milestones, the foundation blocks, or the SOLs, then you actually know that we're looking at something that is developmentally appropriate. There needs to be some kind of process in place to make sure that we are developing and reviewing the standards. Assessment strategies must be ethical remember, we have the NACI Code of Ethics in the back of your textbook and as an appendix, but it also means that when we are assessing children that there are ethical guidelines that we have to abide by. And then the biggest thing is the communication piece. So making sure that everyone's on board. If you're going to do a particular type of assessment, especially if you're looking at whether or not a child might need special education services, that's not something you can just do on your own. You need to communicate with your director. You need to communicate with the families. You may need to communicate with the special education teacher if there's a specialist or something. So everyone needs to be working together and using the same tools to make sure that we're getting accurate information. So that takes care of what we would normally do in class when it comes to Chapter 6. But again, just kind of to highlight with observation, really what I want you to get in the practice of is making sure that you are simply reporting what you see. So when I go over the observation assignment and I'm going to be saying, you need to look for this. When you record what it is that you saw or you heard, that's all that you are reporting. You're not saying, well, the teacher was in a bad mood because the children weren't listening to her. We have no idea if that's the reason that the teacher was in a bad mood. But if instead you say, the teacher raised her voice when she was talking to the children, okay, you're not telling me why, you're just simply telling me that's what happened. If you have two children who are playing with something and then all of a sudden one of them knocks the other one's block structure over, you don't write in your observation that, you know, Johnny and Timmy were playing with blocks and so Timmy knocked Johnny's blocks over because he was mad at him. Okay, you just simply say he knocked his block structure over. So really get into the habit of using those objective statements when you are doing your observations, because then you are making sure that you're reporting the accuracy of what you saw. Another way to think of it is if our entire class was sitting in the classroom together, would we all write the same thing? And the answer should be yes. But if you're not sure that what you wrote is what everyone else would write, then it probably isn't objective. So just go back and make sure that you are just simply writing what you saw. If a child said something, if a teacher said something, then you put it in quotation marks because there's nobody to refute that that's what you heard. So making sure that your observations are very objective and they leave out any assumptions, judgments, or biases. So hopefully this is going to be helpful for you. So again, make sure that you have completed that study guide that I gave you for Chapter 6 because that's going to count as your participation. And so when we come back together, I will do just a quick review of observation and assessment before we get into the actual observation assignment. So have a great day and I will see you on Thursday.